John Marine. I'll be stepping in for Anthony this morning. As you guys usually go through this every morning with Anthony, if you have any questions, please Anthony's email. You can email him for any question you have. Denise is our Safety Academy coordinator. If you have any question for the webinar, you can contact him through his email right there. Usually, and as always, all the webinars will be posted later. To get through that, you just go down here to the Tampa Bay Traffic Safety. When you go to the website, and you go all the way down, and the year, that's where all the webinars will be posted. And this webinar will be posted sometime this week. And as for now, I will turn it to Dennis. He has something more to say.
Okay, if you can turn the screen over to me.
Yes.
Can you see my screen, John?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good morning. This is Dennis Falloon. I'm the Florida Department of Transportation Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy Coordinator and Consultant, and we welcome you to the 6th webinar for the 2018 FDOT Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy. Today's safety webinar topic is Biking Facilities on and Along Roadway, Part 2, presented by Brooke Struve, PE, Safety and Design Engineer, FHWA, and who is based in Colorado. She has a BS in Civil Engineering from Brigham Young University and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Utah. There will be no poll questions today, but I will go ahead and kind of give you an introduction to the Safety Academy and some other comments that I have here for you. Like I said, this is the FDOT Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy, and it's being provided to give local agencies safety-related issues to enhance their safety programs. We're in the 6th year of the Safety Academy, and usually our webinars are on a Wednesday, and they are a 2-hour window, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. And some of the topics will last in the range between 1 and 2 hours, and it depends on the complexity of the topic. And there are 2 links here, one to registration, and one is for the web page, and John just showed you those. This is the calendar, kind of what we have in front of us, what we've already done. And as I said, today is Biking Facilities on and Along the Roadway Part 2. And I also would like to mention that there will be another one on August 8th and September 26th, and another one will be August 15th. It has not been placed into the system yet. It's systemic safety, and that one you'll get more details about that. So there is another one being posted. These webinars are posted for AICP credit. And the last one that Brooke did has not been posted. I was going to send this one and that one in together. So just so if you're looking for it, look for it probably the beginning of next week. Also, if you're a professional engineer and you need the credits in Florida, Larry Hagan does the PDHs. So with that, just like to point out, this is my contact information. And if you need me for anything, you can call me or you can direct it to an email. And with that, John, if you'll turn the screen over to Brooke, I appreciate it very much.
All right, Brooke is now the presenter.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hopefully you're all seeing the first page of the webinar presentation. Is that right?
Yes, Designing for Bicycle Safety.
Excellent. Okay, let's get started then. So as Dennis mentioned, this is the second in a 3-part series on designing for bicycle safety. And today we're going to focus most particularly on the different types of bikeway facilities and some of the design features for them. The next session will talk more particularly about intersections. So we may allude to a few intersection treatments today, but really we'll defer that conversation to the next session in September. Again, I'm Brooke Struve. I'm with the Resource Center. We have different teams in the Resource Center. I'm on the Safety and Geometric Design team, and our role is to provide technical assistance and training and outreach, trying to advance the best practices nationally in transportation. I'm enjoying the weather here in Colorado this week. It's certainly nice to have cooler evenings. And I also like to mention, you know, many people picture the mountains of Colorado and think that's what Colorado is. But if you want to get an image of where I'm based, picture a whistle stop in Kansas, and you probably have a pretty good picture. As I've mentioned before, I'd just like to remind everyone that the field of designing for bicyclists is changing and evolving very rapidly in the U.S., and most particularly the traffic control devices. So I would like you to be very cautious when you're looking at any of the pictures in this presentation, or even in guidance documents that you're looking at, to make sure that you're using the most current application of those. Something may have changed since something came out just last week or last year. And certainly it's difficult to get good images. And so sometimes we have an image that illustrates a concept where the traffic control devices may not be quite on par with the current thinking. In the references, we do have, again, a link to an FHWA website where we identify which traffic control devices are currently under experimentation or interim approval in the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And then just a little refresher or reminder since our last session, there were several concepts that we talked about in terms of why we are focused on designing for bicycle safety. Nationally, 50% of all trips are less than 3 miles, and the typical trip for a casual bike rider is about 1 to 5 miles in length, which is a very bikeable distance, or that 3-mile distance that most trips are is a very bikeable distance. Most of the existing bikeway facilities, are the ones that we've been designing in the more traditional way, are going to be level traffic stress 3, which is comfortable for some adult riders, maybe a very small percentage of adult riders, whereas most adult bicyclists are going to be more comfortable on a level of traffic stress 2 facility. And so as we talk about the different types of bikeways, thinking about what sort of stress we're placing on the bicyclists who may be using them is very important if we want to have a cohesive bicycle network. We also talked about some key safety factors. Sometimes the analysis tools are not as rigorous or refined enough to help us make the decisions that we may have to make. And so just being cognizant of these factors that are going to contribute to or detract from the comfort and the safety of a bicyclist is important. Certainly speed is a huge factor for improving safety, where at 25 miles an hour, 1 out of 10 pedestrians is going to be killed. Alternatively, at 40 or 45 miles an hour, 9 out of 10 pedestrians will be killed in a crash. And so the speeds are important and certainly contribute to comfort. The number of lanes on a roadway, certainly we have higher volumes when there's more lanes, more complex intersections. Visibility, how conspicuous the bicyclist is to motorists, how conspicuous the motorists are to bicyclists, how aware they are of those conflict points. And the conflict points are those points where a bicyclist and motorist are crossing paths. Traffic volume and composition, the more traffic there is, the larger the vehicles there are, the decreased comfort for bicyclists. How close those vehicles are to the bikeway, or if they're actually mixing together. how well the bicyclists control their bicycle. Is the pavement in good condition? Are there alignment issues that are affecting stopping and maneuvering? And then finally, connectivity. And this may be one of the most important aspects of providing bicycling as a meaningful alternative mode of travel. Because if you can't get to where you want to go, there's no point on getting on a bike. This is an example of a bikeway network that is pretty cohesive. This is a map from the city of Austin. It's their bikeway map, where they have actually coded their bikeways according to the level of comfort. Those green areas are paved trails. They've also got high comfort roads, all identified in green. And then the blue corridors are those that are identified as medium comfort. And then the yellow orangish color is a low comfort roadway. We don't have any on this image showing the extremely low comfort roadways, but they do have them identified on their mapping network. So someone can actually figure out a reasonable route to get to where they want to go, knowing where they're going to be comfortable traveling on the roadway network. And just a point of interest, because they do have some hills, which I know Florida doesn't have many hills, if any at all. But in Austin, they even noted some places where there's some steep uphill routes so that people can plan around those as well. But just like our roads and our sidewalks, if our bikeways don't connect up to anything, people aren't going to use them. And it doesn't mean that they all have to be the same type of facility to achieve that comfort level. We'll be combining various types of facilities. That what we want to look for in consistency is providing that consistent level of comfort so that people who are not the strong and fearless bike riders can travel from one end of town to the other. So let's talk about perhaps the nomenclature or the hierarchy of bikeways. And it's not that any particular type of bikeway is better than another. It's choosing the right one for the right application. And perhaps there's a greater level of investment in some facilities than in others. So first off, the shared roadway. Any roadway is a shared roadway as long as bicyclists are legal to ride on that roadway. And then shoulders. Shoulders are technically not a bikeway, particularly when you deal with the intersections, unless you've transitioned it to something else. But they do provide a separate space that bicyclists may use to get out of traffic. And then bike lanes, an exclusive place for bicyclists to travel. And an even more enhanced version of a bike lane would be a separated bike lane. And then at the top of this particular hierarchy, a shared use path, only because that might take some more right-of-way, extra paving, some extra facilities to implement that type of facility. So first, I'd like to talk about the shared roadways. Now this picture, I don't know where the location of the picture is, but it's not all that different from where I live, where I have US 40 that is traveling from Denver on to points easterly in Kansas and westerly in Nevada and so forth. It becomes the main street in my community. And it looks very much like this: limited shoulders, lots of farm fields, pretty good sight lines, and the traffic isn't terribly high because we do have a freeway that runs parallel to us. Now, in a rural location, beyond that perimeter where the casual riders are going to be riding, this might be perfectly appropriate for a bikeway for the strong and confident riders who might be taking that 30-mile bike ride. They have good sight lines. They would ride firmly established in the center of the lane. Hopefully they'd be using some good LED lights, and they'd be very visible. Now, as you approach a community such as mine, we have a little downtown area where we have a couple of gas stations, a Mexican restaurant, a hardware store, a health clinic. It's maybe a half a mile in length. And we have residential neighborhoods branching off of that little community. In this perimeter, you could very easily have casual, less confident riders, and so maybe something more would be appropriate as you get into the downtown area. Maybe some signing, maybe providing some bike lanes through town, or even some shared lane markings, depending on the context. So what we do, providing that network, thinking about who's going to be riding on the network, how far they're going to go, where they might go, is important to help inform what type of facility we might provide. Shared roadways are going to be the most common element in your network, particularly in an urban or suburban area. You might have arterials and collectors where you're providing something more enhanced for bikeways, but on a quiet residential street, you really don't need anything more. Shared roadways are very appropriate for low volume and low speed. Now, when the speeds are higher, you might want some other treatments, but certainly minor roads, if the volumes are less than 1,000 vehicles per day, especially on speeds less than 35 miles an hour, shared lanes are appropriate. In a rural area, you might have those higher speeds. However, it's going to be in that situation like I described in my community where there's long sight distances and low volumes. So there's plenty of opportunities for traffic to see the bicyclists to be aware of and avoid traffic. Now, when we have shared lanes, we can also provide some supplemental features. We can have share the road signs, we can have shared lane markings, also known as sharrows. And certainly when we're talking about signals, if we have signals along a corridor, we want to be thoughtful about making sure there are detectors and timing that's appropriate for sharrows, which we'll talk about in more detail in the next session. Now, this road, I want you to notice here that we've got a speed limit sign that says 40 miles an hour. And generally, this would not be an advisable situation for having a shared roadway application. The speeds are just too high to be comfortable for most bicyclists. However, sometimes we do use shared lane markings to help us pull together that connected network, particularly when we have an interim condition that we just can't deal with immediately. You notice in this picture there is a high spot in the road, and that is where there's a railroad crossing. And if you've had any experience working with the railroads, sometimes it can be difficult and expensive to make any modifications where they have a crossing. In this case, there's a bike lane in advance of and beyond the railroad crossing, but they couldn't get the additional width in the near term to make that bikeway continuous. And so they used the shared lane markings and the shared lane sign as sort of a transitional element to help people get across and through this little trickier situation. Now, the shared lane markings, in that previous slide, you saw it was placed over to the side. That is something that I would not recommend, except in the rarest of circumstances, because really, as a bicyclist, I want to be firmly established in the center of the lane where a motorist can see me. I don't want to disappear in the roadside traffic. More importantly, I don't want motorists to try to pass me within the lane. I had an experience just last month. I was riding in San Francisco on a residential street early in the morning, and I could hear a vehicle coming up behind me. So to try to be polite, I was trying to move over a little bit, which was my mistake. And it was a garbage truck, and the garbage truck did not move over at all for me. It passed me within the lane within just a few feet, and it scared me. I had visions of tipping over and ending up under the wheel of this garbage truck. It's not comfortable. So where we really want bicycles to be is in the center of the lane, owning that space, unless the lane is truly wide enough for reasonable passing. But in most cases, if you have that much space, you have enough space for a bike lane. So it's really not fruitful to put sharrows off to the side. The other factor related to placing them off to the side is what happens with parked cars. We don't have a lot of national data on what happens in a dooring crash where the person in the car opens the car door right in front of the bicyclist, and the bicyclist hits the car door. This could be quite a severe crash because first you're traveling at maybe 8 miles an hour and you hit this narrow door panel. That would hurt. Then you fall off your bike and hit the pavement. That's going to hurt too. And then maybe you've ended up in a travel lane and you get run over by a car. And only at the point at which you were run over by the car is that collected as a crash in some locations. In many locations, they're only recording data on crashes with moving motor vehicles. And since the parked car is not moving, very often we don't get that data collected. But some cities are finding that upwards of 10% of these crashes are happening, or upwards of 10% of the crashes that they have happen to be these dooring type crashes that can be quite severe. So we don't want to put the sharrows too close to parked cars. We want to encourage bicyclists to be away from those locations. And then certainly, if we're at an intersection, if there's different turning movements, all lanes are shared lanes, and you need to consider the turning movements that a bicyclist might need to make and whether they'll want to change lanes or be in other places at the intersection. So when would you choose to place shared lane markings? Certainly situations where you have more than one lane downhill or level. The reason for that is the bicyclist can be in a lane and the motorist can pass because there's multiple lanes going in the same direction. Or if it's downhill, the bicyclist may be traveling as fast as the motorist on that particular roadway. You might choose to use them, as in the example I showed you, on a very short segment to provide that connectivity in your network. Certainly on lower speed roadways where you've got a lot of bicycle travel, that would be a great place to reinforce that behavior on that roadway. It's a shared roadway, everybody's using it. Places where I would be less inclined and very cautious about using shared lane markings is if you have only a single lane of travel in each direction, because there might be another corridor where you want to encourage bicycle travel. If there's a long uphill or a lot of uphill direction because the bicyclist will be moving much slower than motor vehicle traffic. If there is that parallel route option, if it's a very long segment where over the time of travel, there's a lot of cars perhaps backing up behind the bicyclist, maybe that would be less desirable. Where speeds are higher. And then if there isn't bicycle use already, then maybe that isn't a place where there's much demand, or maybe it's not an appropriate corridor for emphasizing bicycle travel. Let me throw a question out to you, and since we don't have polls, I'll just ask you to answer this question in your mind. Which sign would you use if you were trying to emphasize bicycle travel on a shared roadway environment? Have you decided which sign you would use? Okay. What we recommend is using the Bikes on Roadway sign. And there's a reason for that. We have a lot of share the road signs across the country, and it was a great intention. However, what we're finding is people don't fully understand the meaning of that sign. And particularly where we have a lot of variations on the image that goes with that sign. Sometimes we see the bike and the motorist side by side, which might imply that the bike and motorist can pass each other side by side in the lane. Or because the signs are small, we have a bicyclist in front of the motorist, and it looks like the motorist is chasing down the bicyclist. I've seen some very creative signs with yin and yang symbols, which is fun, perhaps, but maybe doesn't convey the right message when yin and yang are opposing forces in conflict. What we recommend is the Bikes on Roadway. And the history of the Share the Road sign, it was originally developed for large farm equipment that was having to travel on highways and, asking motorists and farmers to be polite to each other. But what we're finding is when we use the term share the road, people think of it much like your average 2-year-old would. When your 2-year-old comes to you and wants to share, usually what they want is for you to give them some of what they have, what you have. So, what we're finding is, motorists are thinking the bike should get out of the way and share the road, and bicyclists are thinking the motorist should be polite and let me take the center of the lane, and it hasn't been fully understood. So we use bikes on roadway. Now, if we want something that's a little more regulatory, where we can maybe ticket someone for not being polite to the bicyclist, we also have the bikes may use full lane sign. Although it's interesting because that's a sign that says what the bicyclist may do. It doesn't necessarily tell the motorists what they should be doing. Now, we also have a lot of variations on these sorts of signs where we indicate the minimum distance per passing. And I do know that Florida has a minimum passing distance, but I don't recall the actual distance that you have in place. The little bit of a challenge with these signs is traffic control devices are not usually meant to be educational, and it's difficult to enforce those particular signs. So what we recommend instead is bikes use full lane, or bikes may use full lane, and have a supplemental placard, change lanes to pass. Unless a law enforcement officer has some sort of distance meter to measure, it's really difficult to tell if the motorist left 3 or 4 feet distance between the bicyclist and the motorist. However, if a motorist hits the bicyclist, well, then you know that they didn't follow the passing law. On the other hand, if the motorist fully moves into the other lane to get past the bicyclist, or at least moves over a sufficient amount, you have a good sense that they are being cautious of the bicyclist. Let's look at some examples of some shared roadways. This is a quiet residential street, low speeds, low volume. This would be a level of traffic stress 1, suitable for almost anyone. Children could ride on the street. And here's the other end of the spectrum, which may look very much like a lot of the arterials in Florida, where speeds are at 40 miles an hour and a lot of traffic. This is going to be level of traffic stress 4, and very few bicyclists are going to choose to travel on this corridor. And then certainly we have the rural back roads where you have low volumes and low speeds. This may be suitable for many bicyclists who would be using that roadway. However, as I mentioned, when you get into a community where you have the opportunity for that child to be riding, or a casual, less confident rider to be riding, you might want to do something more than a shared roadway application. Now let's move on to a discussion of paved shoulders. This is going to be useful where you have higher traffic volumes and speeds, but maybe you don't have the volumes or the destinations. This is going to be more the long-term riders who maybe are taking this trip, but you do perhaps have a number of bike riders along the corridor. And this is the frequent application used in rural areas. It might be that you only place shoulders in an area where there's an uphill direction. You've got bicycle travel on the corridor, and maybe there's an uphill stretch where you'd like to give bicyclists the opportunity to move out of the way of traffic and allow traffic to pass. It's not a travel lane, and so you do have to be thoughtful about what happens at intersections. And then we also have challenges related to rumble strips and maintenance. I'll mention here, with maintenance, when you think about all the debris that ends up on the roadside, I like to refer to those bits of tires that you see as roadway crocodiles or roadway alligators. I suppose in Florida you might have some real roadway crocodiles and alligators, but that sort of debris can be hard for the bicyclist, make it hard for the bicyclist to use that shoulder. And even if it's there, they might choose to move into the lane because there has been no sweeping or cleaning in a very long time on that shoulder. So some typical dimensions, this is what's recommended. We usually use the AASHTO shoulder standards. If we're going to provide shoulders for bicyclists, 4 foot would be an absolute minimum. And where we really don't like bikeways that are any less than 5, And here we have the pavement edges, you might have rumble strips. 6 is really going to be desirable. And particularly where these might be roadways where the speeds are very high, so having some extra distance from the motor vehicle traffic. You don't need to have any particular markings or signing for this. I might, in some locations, choose to put some warning signs up, bikes on roadway, just to alert motorists to the bicyclist presence. So here's an example of a shoulder application in a rural location. Here we can see how the rumble strips have affected this bicyclist. Between the pavement edge and the rumble strip, there isn't much bikeway available for the bicyclist to use, and so he's choosing to ride in the roadway, where if the treatments on the shoulder had been a little bit different, they might be out of the way of traffic. So some typical dimensions, and we want to have a minimum clear path of 4 feet. If we've got a curb, that's creating a constraint and an edge there. That curb edge could be struck by a pedal. So having 5 feet of clear space adjacent to a curb. We also want to make sure there's periodic gaps so a bicyclist can maneuver out of the shoulder to make lane changes, to avoid a bus that pulls over to the roadside or a disabled vehicle, or avoid those road crocodiles. Now, the minimum length for those gaps is 12 feet, but think about the maneuvering of the bicyclist. If you're on a downhill stretch where the bicyclist could potentially be riding at 25 miles an hour, maybe you want to make those intervals a little bit longer so they can actually maneuver out if they come upon an obstacle and need to act quickly. And then certainly we want to provide gaps at intersections and driveways. There are some proposed bicycle tolerable rumble strips. However, I'm a bit dubious about their comfort and effectiveness for bicyclists. And just another comment before we move on about rumble strips. We don't want to just eliminate rumble strips altogether if they're the appropriate application. You know, half of our fatalities across the nation are related to run-off-the-road crashes. And so certainly they're a great benefit to saving lives. And so we just want to find a way to use that valuable tool and make it more compatible with bicycle travel on those corridors. So let's talk a little bit about bike lanes. Bike lanes are the designated portion of the roadway for the exclusive or preferential use by people riding bicycles. And you might see some others using bike lanes besides just the bicyclists, like scooters or skateboards. It's really going to depend on your local ordinances on what may or may not be allowed. But I would suggest that anyone who's traveling about the same speed as the bicyclist travels is probably appropriate for using the bike lane. There are some distinct advantages to having a bike lane. On lower stress wide streets where there's a wide bike lane, very comfortable. It provides that crosstown access. If we've got some collectors or arterials across town, having a bike lane provides those connections that you couldn't necessarily provide if you're simply relying on shared roadways. It gives us mobility. It guides bicyclist behavior and makes the bicyclist a little bit more predictable about where they may be. And because you might get more bicycle travel in a bike lane, and because of all the markings related to that, hopefully it's making the bicyclist more visible and conspicuous. A bicyclist gets to travel at their own pace. They're not worried about a car coming up behind them and wanting to get around them. And on the other end of the spectrum, if traffic is congested, maybe the bike lane is the more efficient means of travel. And certainly it's going to reduce pedestrian conflicts. In many locations, a bicyclist who's not comfortable on the roadway will be on the sidewalk, whether it's legal or not. It's interesting, I just read an article in a local magazine in Colorado. The law enforcement officers who ride bikes around the Denver metro area were talking about how, even though they are allowed legally to ride on the sidewalks, they they express the notion that that's where they want to be because they're not comfortable on the roadway. And when they talked about the number of tickets they've actually issued to people riding on the sidewalks, the number was about 16 so far this year, very few in number. They're just not enforcing it because they perceive the threat as well. However, something we want to be cognizant of is this can be a very dangerous place to ride if there's a lot of driveway conflicts, particularly if the bicyclist is traveling against the direction of traffic, because the motorist who's coming out of a driveway does not anticipate a bicyclist who's traveling at higher speed than pedestrian to come towards them or at them on the sidewalk. So this can be a concern. So certainly if we can provide a space for bicyclists where they're more visible and conspicuous, that's going to be an advantage. There's a few disadvantages to bikeways. Certainly if we simply slap a bike lane on a high-stress arterial, it's not going to be suitable for the full range of bicycle travel. It's only going to serve the 1 to 10% of the population that is confident enough to use those bikeways. Very often in application, they've been placed in situations where the bikeway is very narrow. And sometimes we're having to place them at the expense of parking. And there's often a perspective across our country that that space in front of your house or your business is your God-given parking space that you have a right to, and it's very hard politically sometimes to take those parking spaces away. But sometimes we can be creative. Maybe we do something that's contraflow on one side of the street, you know, two-way bikeway on one side of the street, and leave parking on the other side of the street to mitigate that. This is an image from the current bike guide, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials guide for planning and design of bicycle facilities. And I will just mention, if you don't already have a copy of this, I would wait. The new edition of this guide is currently undergoing balloting, and we're going to see a huge change in the next edition of the AASHTO Bike Guide. But this is what consistently has been recommended for width, somewhere between 5 and 7 feet. We have had a lot of 4-foot bike lanes in the past, but that's really making it just a little bit too narrow. And if we can get a little bit more space, that's helpful. The other thing I like to talk about is, you know, we want to avoid having multiple minimums. We might have a corridor where we've got the barest minimal space that we can have for parking, and then we've maybe got a 4-foot bike lane, and maybe we've got 10-foot lanes, and it's a corridor where we've got truck traffic and buses, and by compromising everything across the corridor, maybe we've only got a 3-foot sidewalk on one side of the street, we've made a corridor that's really uncomfortable for everyone and going to create some challenges. Maybe we've got to think about this in terms of emphasizing motor vehicle traffic on one corridor, and maybe there's a parallel corridor we can emphasize the multimodal travel, and trying to make those trade-offs and balances. Sometimes we've got to make some tough choices. Maybe we need to take away lanes, consider a roadway reconfiguration or a road diet. I like the term that California uses. They call them roadway buffets. Here's just another image from the same bikeway guide in a situation where there is no parking. If you have a curb, you need to have at least a 5-foot bike lane, but also remember that lift of the gutter pan can be a problem for that bikeway control and effectively narrows up that bikeway. So having that a little bit of extra space is important. Here's an image where you can see that that curb is not, that gutter pan is not an effective place for travel. And even more so, that drain is a hazard for a bicyclist who might catch a tire in it. Now, if we're going to increase the comfort of a bikeway, one of the ways that we can do that is make it a buffered bike lane. And there's a lot of ways we can do this. There's arguments for placing the buffer between the bicyclist and moving motor vehicle traffic, or the buffer can be placed between the bicyclist and parked cars to ameliorate that dooring issue, or we can split the difference a little bit. And there's some great benefits to having that buffer because it provides passing. If there's a lot of bicyclists traveling the corridor, they can now pass a slower moving bicyclist without getting into the travel lane. I'd also like to point out here the way in which this bikeway is marked. There's enough width here that chevrons would probably be the preferred choice because in the MUTCD, that's what you place between two parallel moving travel lanes. Now, if the buffer space is much narrower, you can use the slants, or even if it's very narrow, maybe you just have two parallel stripes. Having the buffer painted out is helpful, particularly in this location where motorists might get confused that the bike lane is a motor vehicle lane because it's almost as wide as a motor vehicle lane. So having that buffer painted out is helpful and can be helpful in terms of positioning the bicyclists relative to the traffic or the parked cars. I'd also like to mention the dashed striping on one side. This is what some agencies are going towards to better imply that motorists may still be crossing the bikeway because they're getting into those parking spaces instead of having two solid parallel lines running along the buffer. So some of the things that we've talked about here are certainly shy distance, bike passing, the door zone, and not confusing motorists. And certainly it makes a much more comfortable bikeway facility. This is an image from the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Streets Design Guide, where they've got some different examples of how these bikeways might be marked. On the right side, you can see they've got some little tick marks to help keep motorists closer to the curb when they park, as well as a parallel line to keep bicyclists out of the door zone area. And they've used those slanted lines to mark out the buffer. On the left side, where maybe they didn't have as much space, they just used two parallel lines to mark out that buffer space, where they marked both the door zone as well as the buffer space between the bicyclist and the moving traffic. So this is an example of a very wide bike lane on a low-speed street. This is going to be comfortable for everyone to use. Here, we've got a roadway where the speed is at 30 miles per hour. We've got a 5-foot bike lane, although it's a little less than 5 because of the gutter pan, but the width is there and available. So we've got a level of traffic stress too. On this roadway, we still have that 5-foot bike lane, but the speeds have increased up to 35 miles an hour. So that level of traffic stress is decreased. We're starting to eliminate children and less confident adult bike riders from the bikeway network on this corridor. And then finally, I'd like to point out this gentleman and what he's wearing. You know, we think of our confident and fearless riders as those wearing spandex and having high performance gear. This gentleman may be a strong and fearless rider with just his pedestrian bike, or he may be someone who his car's in the shop that day. And so out of necessity, he's on that bike because he has no other alternative. And this is the only corridor he has to ride on to get to where he needs to go. And it's level of traffic stress 4, very uncomfortable. Just a few more comments about pavement marking and signing for bike lanes. You do have to have longitudinal markings to mark out that bike lane, as well as, and it's advised to have that line between the traffic and the bike lane, as well as between the bike lane and any parked cars. You need to have the symbols at the beginning and at the end, and at some interval. Now, the interval isn't very well defined, and that's really going to depend on the context. If you don't have any access points for quite some distance, maybe you would reduce the number of bike lane markings. But you also want to put enough bike lane markings so that people don't forget that that is, in fact, a bike lane. However, if you have a location where there's some side streets coming in or some driveways, you probably want to put a bike lane marking at a very short interval, or certainly after every intersection that comes in. But also where you have a lot of driveways, maybe you want to keep them at an interval where when you're at one one pavement marking, you can see the next one up ahead in the distance. And then we can place bike lane signs. Let me just throw another question out to you. Are bike lane signs, such as the one noted on the right, you'll see that the sign has evolved over the years, but are they required? Do you have to have a bike lane sign to be consistent with the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices? Hopefully you've all decided what the answer is. In fact, you are not required to have bike lane signs. It was a requirement in the past in previous editions of the METCD. However, it's not required now. So being thoughtful about it. In an urban area where you have a lot of sign clutter and where you have well-marked bike lanes and it's very obvious, maybe they're not so necessary, or maybe you only place them in some strategic locations. Perhaps in a more rural area, or maybe where there might be some confusion about the fact that it's a bike lane, then you'd want to use the sign with more frequency. And certainly some municipalities, if they want to enforce motor vehicle behavior and keeping them from parking in that space, you might have to have some bike lane signs so that law enforcement officers can ticket people who happen to park in that space. Now, I did mention that sometimes, maybe to preserve parking, or there might be some other reasons, we want to put a contraflow bike lane where the bicyclist is traveling against traffic on the roadway. It might be on a one-way street to provide continuity. Thinking about how bicyclists are traveling, they're out in the weather. It might be humid and hot, it might be cold and rainy. They want to spend as little time getting from one point to another. They're having to travel under their own pedal power. And so going around the block to go along with traffic on a series of one-way streets is putting them at risk of being in traffic for much longer. And they have more intersection maneuvers to accomplish, whereas there might be a much more direct route. And you might see that you already have bicyclists traveling contraflow on that one-way street. It would be a good idea to provide a bike lane to provide that connection, because there may already be a demand for it. Some of the considerations we have is certainly the pavement markings. You've now turned a one-way street into a two-way street, and you need to mark it appropriately. And the intersections, the signing, all have to be updated to be appropriate with that. And just a comment about street name signs. I've noticed in some areas where they've installed contraflow bike lanes, and at the intersections, all the street name signs are oriented to motor vehicle travel. Well, bicyclists need to know where they're going as well. And I'd also argue pedestrians do too. And so I would, as a practice, always put double-sided street name signs in your network, because people who are traveling on the sidewalk need to be able to navigate, as well as motorists who are driving on the roadway. But even more than that, the intersection treatments are very important. If you've got signals that are all oriented for traffic on a one-way street, you need to make sure that there's a signal head that's appropriate for bicyclists to use. You might need some special signing. If you've got stop conditions for side streets coming onto the roadway, maybe having a supplemental placard to alert motorists that what used to be a one-way street is now a two-way street. They need to be looking both directions for bicyclists and motorists on that roadway. You might even choose to enhance the markings where the bike lane crosses that side street, just to alert motorists to the two-directional nature of the roadway. Now, separated bike lanes is something we're going to talk about next. This is simply a bike lane with some enhancements. And let me throw a question out to you. We've had a lot of terms for different types of bike facilities. Are bike lanes, cycle tracks, and protected bike lanes talking about the same thing? Have you heard those terms, and have you understood what they meant? They are, in fact, synonymous terms for what we're talking about. initially, when they started to be built in the US, we were calling them cycle tracks. And that was because they were originally a Dutch design. And when the Dutch was translated into English, when they were started using them in England, well, in England, they talk about cycles rather than bicycles. And in England, you don't go hiking on a trail, you go hiking on a track. And so what they really were talking about were bicycle trails. And this is just more of an enhancement of a bikeway to give them a better bike lane, better space between the motorists and the bicyclists. Now, we don't speak British English, we speak American English, so maybe there would have been a different term that would be more appropriate. Protected bike lanes started growing in favor as a term. However, when we're developing national guidance, we try not to use words like that because they become lawyer bait. If we have defined something as a protected bike lane and then we don't choose to design it according to that particular guideline, then did we just build an unprotected bike lane? Are we now then liable if someone got hurt because we didn't give them a protected bike lane? So that's how we ended up with the rather cumbersome terminology separated bike lane. And let's define what a separated bike lane is. It's an exclusive bike facility, much like a bike lane, adjacent to or on the roadway. It may be one-way or contraflow. All of these are just like bike lanes. What's different about the separated bike lane from a traditional bike lane is it has a buffer and it is separated by some form of a vertical element to provide a more enhanced separation between traffic and the bicyclist. Now, having that vertical element does not create a magic force field. It's just a more positive form of traffic control and guidance that hopefully increases that visibility, conspicuity, and provides that buffer and level of comfort for the bicyclist. Some of the advantages of the separated bike lane: it's very low stress in a mid-block location. It encourages bike rides, it's much more conspicuous, and we are seeing crash rate reductions. Some of the disadvantages: we may need some special treatments when we encounter intersections, driveways, parking, transit stops, and loading zones. And we'll talk about some ways that we can treat those. It does take a little bit more space than just simply adding a stripe for a 5-foot bike lane. And it can be more costly depending on how fancy you want to make your separated bike lane. And then finally, we are still learning about the best approaches and techniques. The current AASHTO guide didn't address separated bike lanes in any sort of way, or cycle tracks or protected bike lanes. It did talk minimally about side paths, and generally the sense of the discussion was they're difficult to deal with at intersections, so we don't recommend them. However, I would argue that any bike lane has difficulties at intersections, but maybe we haven't been doing well enough to address bicycle travel at intersections. Certainly, this is a guide that came out in 2015. It has a lot of case studies. It talks about what we know and what we don't know yet, and our evolving experience. And this is a publication that is free and available online. This is another guidance document I'd like to recommend to you. This is the Massachusetts DOT Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide. It also came out in 2015, and it takes it a little bit further. It has some threshold values where it recommends different types of treatments, different types of width. It's also the only U.S. publication of which I'm aware that treats the protected intersection that we'll talk about in our next session. The MassDOT guide is also free and available online. So why would you choose to enhance your bike facility going from a traditional bike lane to a separated bike lane? Well, thinking about, are there already cyclists using the corridor, or is there potential that cyclists could use that corridor? Is it a major connection that would provide that missing link in your network? And would it help you provide that low stress network so that children and less comfortable adults can travel by bicycle to get to their destinations? And is it providing a part of your network for the disadvantaged populations? I've been to Laredo, Texas, and witnessed some of the travel challenges they have there, where they have upwards of 80% truck traffic on some of their arterials, and they have no means for some of their populations to get to their workplaces other than on bike or on foot in this very uncomfortable environment. So something like a separated bike lane could really be a consideration for those populations. This is an example from the MassDOT guide where they have some recommendations. Now, in the image, you see they've used curbs as the vertical feature to separate that bike lane. Now, because there are constraints on the bike lane, you need to be thoughtful about the need for passing. If you're going to pass another bicyclist who's moving more slowly, you need at least 6.5 feet to get around them. However, if you have higher volumes of bicyclists traveling in that corridor, you might want to consider a greater width to provide for that space. You can go to narrow constraints. You can go as narrow as 4 feet if you have something like a bus stop or an accessible parking space to make those accommodations, but then you would widen the bike lane out as they continue on. And this is an example of a two-way bike lane where you have space for travel in both directions as well as that passing opportunity. If your volumes are very low, maybe you don't need as much space. Maybe there's opportunities to pass when there's not a bicyclist coming from the other direction. But if the volumes are higher, you might want to provide room for passing in both directions at the same time. What should we do, or how should we think about the space we have available to us when we don't have all the space we'd like to have? Well, the MassDOT guide, they have a suggested way of thinking about it. First of all, if you're going to make some compromises, do you have some space from the street that you can borrow? Are you using 12-foot lanes where maybe an 11 or a 10-foot lane would be appropriate? Do all of those travel lanes need to be the same width? Or maybe the buses are only operating in the rightmost lane, so you could go even narrower in the left lane. And then that sidewalk buffer. Maybe the sidewalk buffer isn't the highest priority. You could go very narrow, or perhaps even eliminate some of that sidewalk buffer space. And then go with a narrower street buffer. Finally, we can think about maybe compromising that width available for the separated bike lane. And last of all, maybe we make some compromises in the sidewalk. And of course, this is going to be an iterative thought process, trying out what might be the best configuration for the context given those constraints. When we're thinking about what we might choose for that vertical separating element, there are some considerations about the safety of the bicyclist, the safety of the motorist, maintenance, and appearance. You know, a residential neighborhood might not be too thrilled about all these yellow reflective posts popping up in their neighborhood like little yellow trees. So thinking about all of those things when we select what we choose. This is an example from Atlanta, Georgia, where they've used a bevel curb, a very nice retrofit application where they could come in and bolt those down. It provides the separation and is consistent with the other curbing that they have in the community. In Austin, they use what they call turtles. They use essentially salad bowls to form these concrete domes that they place along the corridor. This might be a bit of concern when you're talking about the impact of a bicyclist hitting one of those. It could be quite a severe problem, so you want to be careful about placement of that, certainly not placing it in an area where you've got a narrow bikeway. In this application, they have a transit line on rails that runs along the corridor, so they had a very strong desire to keep bicyclists out of that space, so maybe the more aggressive design would be appropriate in that location. This is one of my favorite devices that have been used. In Texas, they're calling these armadillos. It's sort of an oblong-shaped rubber device. It's hollow, but it does have diaphragms that gives it structural strength. And these are really quite durable. Where the vertical reflective posts can get knocked down quite easily, these can take a lot of vehicle strikes without needing to necessarily be replaced. They might show some damage, but they hold up very well. In terms of placement, you want to be careful about orientation. In this case, the bike lane that's closest to these is running parallel to motor vehicle travel. The bicyclists will be traveling towards us from the screen. And so those armadillos are oriented so the bicyclists could move into the motor vehicle lane. Now, the bicyclists are traveling against motor vehicle traffic. We would not want them moving into the motor vehicle lane. And so the way that those are oriented prevents them from doing so. Here we have some rigid bollards, and this is something that we'd want to be very cautious about because those rigid bollards do present a risk to both motorists and bicyclists. And so if we're using a very narrow buffer space, as we're showing here, maybe I would choose a more forgiving type of separating device. And then this is similar to what they do in San Francisco. This is Vancouver, British Columbia, where they've used planters as a dividing space. I would still be thoughtful and cautious about the risk that this might pose to motorists in terms of the blunt ends and how they're placed and how closely they're placed so that motorists are not exposed to a greater risk in a run-off-the-road type crash. But they are very attractive. It is an opportunity to provide some green landscaping along the corridor because they have placed gaps between them. They're not obstructing the drainage flow across the street. Here we have a raised median application, very attractively done. They've got a planter on the raised median to add some landscaping. They also have a signal pole in that space as well. And then this is a location in New York City where the corridor is coming off one of the bridges. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of bicycle traffic, and they've gone to a very substantial separation between bicyclists and motorists using concrete barrier with a rail on top to provide the appropriate height for a bicyclist who might run into that barrier. We don't want them falling into traffic. Now let's talk about some of the curbside activity that we might have to address in a separated bike lane. But as I said, maybe we could be treating these types of locations even better when we're talking about our traditional bike lanes as well. This would be where we have motor vehicle parking, a loading zone, bike parking locations where we might have bus stops that we need to consider. So this is an example from the separated bike lane, the graphic on the top, where we have a loading zone area where they've taken up some of the bikeway space, and they've just bent the bike lane out to go around it and provided some enhanced markings at that loading zone location. Providing a curb ramp if it's an accessible loading zone location, marking a crosswalk, making it much more conspicuous. You might use a yield marking or stop bar for stopping for pedestrians or yielding for pedestrians along with the sign. And we have an example of this on the lower right, and this is in California, where they've created a loading zone space and they've enhanced the markings at that location. At transit stops, there's a lot of things that we need to consider. One of the early applications of a separated bike lane was in a city in which they forgot about the transit stops along the corridor. So they built this nice bike lane that had curbs separating it from traffic, and now all of the transit stops are inaccessible. So it could have been a costly mistake if they'd had to go back and retrofit that. They were able to coordinate with the transit agency and move that transit line to a parallel corridor. But if that hadn't been an option, they would have had to go back and fix it. So some of the things you might think about because of the conflicts is maybe the bike lane can be on the opposite side of the street from the transit stops. If they are on the same side of the street, we want to think about guiding the passengers and communicating to the bicyclists where those conflicts are. Certainly it's a good idea to have two crossings, one at the front and one at the back, because pedestrians are like wildlife. They're going to take the most direct route. And so if they're headed one direction, but your crossing is at the far end, they're not going to use it. They'll just cut across. And also, often buses will have doors at the front and the back. We have what we usually refer to as a floating bus stop. It's sort of just an island that's out there for passengers to load and unload. And that is a great design. If we don't have the space to do that, we can do in-lane operation, but we just want to be cognizant of the higher risks. Here's an example of one of those floating islands. In this case, they provided some railings to help control that wildlife factor of the pedestrians to direct them to the crossings. The crossings are accessible. The island is wide enough to meet the accessibility requirements. So it has to be 8 feet wide, and there has to be at least a 5-foot level pad in width that is so that someone has the width as they exit from the door and there's enough width of the island so that they can use the lift that the bus may have. We can use the intersections as our crossing locations if the bus stop is located near the intersections. And then we can also use yield or stop line markings. We can use green pavement. We can use raised crosswalks at these locations, which might have the added benefit of slowing down bicyclists as they're approaching the bus stop. This is an image of an inline operation. In this case, the bus can pull all the way to the curb. We've changed the markings from the typical bike lane markings to more of a shared lane marking, even enhanced it with some pavement messages saying bus only. So in this case, the bus hopefully is looking for bicyclists before they move into the bike lane to pull up to the curb. And the bicyclists who are approaching at that point can choose to move into the motor vehicle lane to pass the bus or simply wait behind. I think in most cases they'd be more likely to move into the motor vehicle lane. Now, when you have this kind of operation, or even if you're doing some sort of shared bike lane, being thoughtful about the headways on the buses, how often a bicyclist might have to maneuver around a bus. If the bicyclist moves around the bus, are they likely to stay ahead of that bus, or is the bus later going to pass them? These are things to think about in terms of the interval of the bus stops, how fast the buses are moving, and how many buses the bicyclist might encounter. And the same considerations go into these bus stop designs. Now, a variation that can be done on this is if the bike lane at the bus stop location is raised to curb height so that passengers can unload and load at a curb, then the bus can stay out of the bike lane entirely. The bus would simply pull up to the curb at where in this image we have that dashed line. We instead have a curb that's at the sidewalk level. And so passengers can unload. It's still accessible, but the bus is not crossing the bicyclist's path of travel. The one risk of that, hopefully as the bus pulls up, the bicyclists would be aware of and paying attention to passengers unloading. But if you have that one straggling passenger who's collecting their things and steps out late, the bicyclist might have already started moving forward and might potentially hit that straggling passenger who's now just left the bus that they couldn't anticipate or couldn't see. So that's one potential concern and risk in that particular design. And finally, let's talk a little bit about the challenges of having railway type transit facilities on our roadways where bicycles are traveling. On the left, we have an image of a typical rail line in a pavement. Notice that that gap is about 2 inches wide, which is as wide or wider than a lot of bicycle tires. And there have been a number of incidents where a bicyclist crossing or traveling along a roadway have gotten their tire caught and they've fallen over and been injured quite badly. Some cities have tried out some variations of different signs to try to warn bicyclists. When a bicyclist crosses a railway, they need to be at about a 60-degree angle to that roadway. Anything less than that, they're at risk of getting trapped. And so something like this sign or some wayfinding markings as the bicyclist is crossing that railway to help them orient correctly so that they don't cross it at too oblique an angle is going to be very beneficial for safety. Now, this is one of those signs that you probably will not ever see in the MUTCD. At the recent summer meeting of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, they reported out on some research they did on several graphical signs as well as some word signs on how to communicate to bicyclists to be careful because of the railway. And it turned out from the research that there was a word sign in particular that was best understood by bicyclists. And so that's going to be recommended by the National Committee. Hopefully soon we'll see some graphics on what that looks like in the precise language. So there is more coming for bicycle travel related to these railways. And here we have an image of some bicyclists who are traveling on this, where you can see the potential risk as they're changing lanes, trying to maneuver through the roadway where they could get a tire trapped. And this is a treatment where they had a transit line that ran along the bike lane, and you come to this transit stop. That space was needed for the landing zone for the pedestrians exiting the transit vehicle. And so in this case, they provided some wayfinding to direct the bicyclists behind the transit stop on the sidewalk and back around to where they can avoid those tracks and not be at risk. So we've talked about a number of different bikeway facilities. We talked about shared lanes, we've talked about bike lanes, we've talked about buffered bike lanes and separated bike lanes. We didn't address shared use paths. There is a lot of information and experience available on those, but there again, when we talk about intersections, those intersections could probably be the biggest challenge where the people in the shared use path are having to cross motor vehicle traffic. One thing I will mention about shared use paths is I would anticipate some enhanced guidance for width coming out in the next AASHTO guide. What we're finding is when we build a new shared use path in an urban area, they become so popular and so used by the dog walkers and the strollers and the bicyclists that they get quite a bit of congestion. In Atlanta, they've been opening up what they call the Beltway. And as they open each new segment, they're finding a lot of popularity. They're getting 700 users a day. An even more extreme example is in Chicago, along their Lakeshore Drive or the Lakeshore area, they have a shared use path that's getting 20,000 users a day. So simply using that 8-foot or 10-foot width is not going to be adequate. And so I think the newest recommendations are going to be that if you're putting in a new bikeway in an area where you expect high usage because it's a recreational area or it's in an urban area, you might want to consider starting at 14 feet so that you don't have to go back later and address those issues. Here, there are a number of references that I've mentioned. One that I haven't mentioned yet that I will point out now is the very last link. It's on our Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices website, and it's the frequently asked questions about bike facilities. And that's where some of the information is about the road signs and other signs and traffic control devices. There's also another link on this page. I'm not picking it out at the moment. I think it's the one just above the bicycle pedestrian guidance on the NUTCD on our environmental website, where it talks about those devices that are experimental or have interim approval and has all the information related to those. So just some summary thoughts. We have a lot of tools in our toolkit for creating a network that can actually be useful for transportation purposes, trying to capture those trips that are 3 miles or less that are very bikeable. And if we have that network available where people feel comfortable riding, then it becomes a viable form of travel. A lot of our local streets can be just as they are and be suitable in comfort. But when we get to the busier, faster moving traffic, that's where we need to think about something like a separated bike lane or even a shared use path that's off the roadway to provide for that comfortable travel. So I'd like to turn it over to John and all of you who've been listening. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address those. And thank you very much for your attention and participation.
John, before you make any comments, this is Dennis Falloon. Brooke, I've got something that somebody sent me an email on. I'm going to read it to you. It's a little lengthy, but not too long. Don't think a bicycle should travel down the street with his or her back turned to an approaching motorist. Consider a motorist on a cell phone approaching a bicyclist from behind while the motor vehicle drifts into the bicycle lane. That bicyclist would be killed. The same bicyclist facing the same motorist could seize the motor vehicle and try to avoid being hit. I don't know what that applies to, but I wanted you to see if you can answer it.
I do understand the question, and we do see a lot of people riding contraflow on our roadways, and I think that comes from a couple of places. For one, at least when I was a child, we were taught that if you're walking along the roadway, you should walk against traffic so you can see the traffic approaching you. My husband tells me that he was actually taught you should ride your bike against traffic. And people from other countries who may have immigrated here, very often that's what they've been taught to do as well. And you're right, there is the potential that someone will drift off the road into the bike lane. However, the risk that seems to be greater is the motorists coming from side streets don't expect the bicyclists coming from the opposite direction. And so they are very likely to pull into the bike lane in front of that bicyclist or hit the bicyclist as they're departing that driveway or turning into that driveway, because they're just not looking for bikeway traffic coming in the contraflow direction. And we're finding that, I know they did a study in the Phoenix area, 90% of their fatalities for bicyclists were when the bicyclist was traveling against traffic. So I think we're finding the traffic data bears that out. If we do have situations where motorists are creeping into the bike lane, I'd be looking at some things like, well, certainly texting and driving is going to be a concern. And maybe that's where having those vertical reflectors can help reinforce better driver behavior, because that's going to catch their attention. But maybe there's something like a curve where the motorists are cutting around the corner a bit, and maybe we can just reinforce, provide a little extra width in that location, or provide some vertical reflectors just at that location. Maybe there's a weaving area where you have some difficulties. So, there are some ways we can control and encourage that. But what we're finding is the greater risk is those intersection driveway conflicts for bicyclists who are traveling against traffic.
Okay. John, did you have any questions in there or in the question area or the chat that you'd like to give to Brooke?
Yes, we do have one question, and the question is, when is the anticipated release of the new guidelines from AASHTO as mentioned?
Well, it's hard for me to predict. I know it's going through their balloting process. It should be the final vote before they release it. But at that point, I think it needs to go through their publication and editors and, get dressed up for publication. So I would say, 6 months to 9 months would be my best guess, but don't hold me to that.
Are there any other questions, John?
As of right now, that was the only question.
Okay.
We have another one that just come up. It says, Is there any news on PRORAG adoption?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, John.
Yeah, the question is there any news on PRORAG adoption?
Oh, the PRORAG adoption. Well, that is even more difficult at the moment because, the message that's been coming from the current federal administration is that anytime you add a new legislation or a new regulation, you have to remove 2 regulations. And I know the Access Board has been struggling with how do you deal with that. Hopefully, they're working through that issue, but just the regulatory environment at the federal level has really slowed that down. So I would say to you, continue using the PROAG as the best practice and best information available, but it may be some time before the regulatory issues are worked out.
All right. Another question is, are you aware of standards for keyholes at right-turn lanes? The new Florida design manual implies that keyholes are not required for speed greater than 45 miles per hour. I don't know if the person is talking about in general, if you know any keyholes.
Well, I think there are some good practices that are shown in the NACTO guides that you can find online for free. They have some good images of how you might design different keyholes on the approach to an intersection. I would say, and I guess if I understood the question correctly, Florida is saying that you don't need to have it if the speed is greater than 45 miles an hour. I guess what I would say in that situation is, if the speeds are greater than 45 miles an hour, only your most confident bicyclists are out there on the roadway. You're serving very few people, and if you've got a bike lane, I've got some real concerns about not providing a keyway at the intersection, particularly at those speeds. I'd be more inclined to say that if you have to omit them, only do it at a lower speed where you can transition to a share row at the intersection and then go back to a bike lane once you get beyond the intersection. But we will talk more about the keyways when we get to the intersection section. So hopefully we can have some discussions then in September that will help illuminate the topic.
All right. Another question is, what is your opinion of the practice of rumble strips located on the white lines, edge of pavement lines?
That's personally my favorite. It does a couple of things for you. For one thing, it gives more space to the bicyclist who might be using the shoulder or even a bike lane if you've got rumble strips between the bike lane and the travel lane. But the other advantage is, because the stripe is hitting a vertical face on that rumble strip, even in wet conditions where the stripes would normally be covered with water and not reflective anymore, you still have that vertical edge that becomes very visible in dark, wet conditions. So I think there's a double advantage there.
All right, thank you. And for now, that's all the questions we have. If anybody else have any question, I encourage you to ask them right now, please.
Well, and I will just add that, if you download the presentation, it has all of those references that I've provided for you, as well as my contact information. And this is what I do: is I answer questions, provide support. You are certainly welcome to reach out to the FHWA division office in Florida. They can put you in touch with me, or you can reach out to me directly, and if you have a particular need or you want a second pair of eyes on something related to bikeway facilities, we'd be glad to help. Our interest is improving safety for all modes of travel on our national network.
With that, if there's no more questions, you can stop the recording, John, and we'll hang in here for a couple of minutes and see if anybody else has any other questions. Thank you so much for attending today.
All right. Yes, I will stop the recording now.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Oh, you're welcome.